Magic was never hidden in books or bloodlines or forgotten languages, but trapped instead inside reflections living only where the world copied itself. Because every mirror, every pane of glass, every puddle after rain held a second version of reality that looked identical, but obeyed different rules. And people learned early that reflections could not be trusted, not because they lied, but because they remembered things the real world had forgotten. And from childhood, everyone was warned never to stare along, never to wave, never to smile at their own reflection. First, because the reflected world was not an echo, but a waiting place. A realm of immense power sealed behind surfaces humanity could see but never touch. And for centuries this rule held because reflections remained obedient, silent, perfectly aligned, until the first crack appeared in a mirror no one important was watching. In a small apartment where a girl named Alira stood brushing her hair after midnight, exhausted from a life that felt thinner than it should, when she noticed her reflection lagged by half a breath, not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel wrong, like a skipped heartbeat. And when she blinked, her reflection blinked back to late. And when she froze, it kept moving, raising its hands slowly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking a rule it had waited generations to test. And Alira should have screamed or run or smashed the mirror. But instead she felt a deep recognition settle in her chest, the sense that the reflection was not a monster, but a witness. And when it spoke without sound, forming words only she could somehow understand, it did not ask to be freed or threaten her life, but simply said, "We have been holding the magic for you." And in that moment, Alira learned the truth humanity had buried. That magic had been exiled into reflections long ago when it grew too powerful, when spells bent nations and wishes collapsed empires, when the world decided that reality could not survive unchecked miracles. And so the elders of that forgotten age struck a bargain with the mirrored world, sealing magic inside copies, allowing reflections to become guardians of power. Too dangerous for flesh, but over time the reason was lost, the fear softened into superstition, and the reflections were left alone with their burden, growing restless as humanity repeated the same mistakes without the tools to fix them. And cracks began to appear, not because reflections wanted escape, but because the world itself was fracturing under the weight of problems magic had once been designed to solve. And as days passed, Alira noticed more anomalies, reflections that smiled when they shouldn't, windows that showed skies too perfect to belong to her city, puddles that reflected people who were not present. And soon, others noticed too, though none could interact the way she could, because Alira had been born with an unusual emptiness, a lack of reflection of self, someone who had spent her life feeling unreal, unnoticed, thin at the edges, and that absence made space for the reflected world to speak through her. And when she finally pressed her hand against the cracked mirror, the glass did not shatter, but softened like water, sending a pulse through every reflective surface in the city, awakening the mirrored realm fully for the first time in centuries. And what people saw terrified them, because reflections no longer matched, showing cities healed to decayed skies, unpolluted people, standing taller, eyes brighter, wounds absent, and magic alive everywhere in the reflected world, shaping architecture, weather, even time, revealing not a nightmare, but a better version of reality, one built with intention rather than survival. And panic followed revelation, as governments tried to cover mirrors, bend glass, shatter windows, drain lakes, but reflections do not disappear when ignored. They simply find new surfaces. And soon magic began leaking through the cracks, not as spells, but as consequences. Broken mirrors causing gravity to bend, reflections stepping out for seconds at a time before snapping back, leaving behind flowers growing through concrete, illnesses fading, machines repairing themselves. And the reflected beings grew desperate, not for freedom, but for partnership, because they could not cross fully without collapsing both worlds. And they needed humans willing to anchor magic safely, to accept responsibility for power long denied. And Alira became the bridge, whether she wanted to or not, speaking to reflections that were wiser, older, and tired of waiting, learning that magic in the reflected world was not limitless, but disciplined, bound by empathy, because they had learned through isolation what humanity never did. That power without restraint destroys itself. And as resistance grew from those who feared change more than collapse, cracks spread wider, mirrors breaking on their own, not in violence, but in invitation. And the final fracture came not from war or sabotage, but from a single child dropping a small, handheld mirror on a sidewalk, where instead of shattering, it split cleanly down the center, opening a thin doorway through which reflected light poured like breath held along. And through that crack, magic did not flood the world, but filtered and carefully, selectively choosing moments of need, choosing people willing to listen rather than dominate, and the reflected world did not replace reality or conquer it, but slowly merged, teaching humanity how to see itself honestly, how to confront the ugliness reflections had been forced to hold alone. And years later, mirrors returned to normal, reflections aligned once more, magic no longer visible yet no longer exiled, woven instead into choice, compassion, restraint, and responsibility. And when people asked what had changed, why the world felt different without any obvious miracle, Alira would smile faintly at her reflection, now perfectly synchronized, and say that magic was never trapped in mirrors, only waiting there until humanity was brave enough to look at itself without flinching, because the greatest spell had not been the cracking of glass but the decision to finally step out of denial and accept the power of seeing clearly.